Coburn.
It's Tuesday, the 22nd of November. This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Alec Shelbrooke, Labour's leader in the Lords, Angela Smith, LBC presenter Iain Dale and Yahoo News political correspondent Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. Today, the Labour leader sounds a tough note on immigration.
Our common goal must be to help the British economy off its immigration dependency.
But his audience of business chiefs want higher immigration now to solve worker shortages. So would a Labour government bring down overall levels of migration? Also today, Liz Truss was in and out of Downing Street within a mere 44 days. How will history judge her time in office? And would scrapping the House of Lords help restore trust in politics? Let's start with this headline in the Daily Mail. It says, you pay for MPs' Xmas parties. It refers to a story that IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, says MPs can host office Christmas parties at taxpayers' expense. Now, we wanted to find out a little bit more detail about the story and behind the headline. We spoke to IPSA this morning. They said the guidance on Christmas parties is new, but the rules have not changed. IPSA also said to suggest that there is anything inappropriate in this is simply incorrect. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Alec, is this guidance sensible?
I mean, IPSA was brought in to bring back faith in the parliamentary system and expenses. I really think they've scored an own goal on this one. I mean, I always... Actually, I cook Christmas dinner for my staff each year around my house. This year we're actually going to a restaurant.
They might prefer to go out somewhere.
And, but the idea you would claim for that on expenses, I think, is ridiculous. And I mean, I didn't even know about this until I saw this morning's newspaper. Apparently it came in a bulletin over the weekend. But I don't think it does anything to improve the faith in politics when you're being told you can claim for your Christmas party. It's an utter nonsense.
Well, I mean, it's up to MPs, apparently, to decide if they see fit to reward their staff in this way. As they say, IPSA, the overall envelope hasn't changed, but they have made this specific guidance clear. No alcohol is included, and it must represent value for money. Is the guidance sensible?
That was going to be a great party, wasn't it? Actually, I really feel sorry for MPs on this one. The guidance wasn't asked for. IPSA have said this. I doubt, like Alex, if any MPs are going to take a so-called advantage of it. But it isn't unusual for employers to have a Christmas party for their staff. But with we've seen that the allowance that MPs have to run their office has been reduced. There isn't really any money left over. So I just think this is a bit of a silly advice from IPSA, completely unnecessary. And I'm actually starting to feel sorry for MPs on this one.
Oh. Well, you can feel sorry for them
if
you like.
Well, it makes it sound like they're taking their mates out for a few drinks.
Well, I mean, this is for their staff. Apparently, there had been queries. That's why IPSA did respond. There may not have been an overwhelming number, but perhaps from some of the newer MPs, we've had COVID and the pandemic, were asking about what the guidance might be. Sensible or not?
No, it's not sensible. I mean, you can understand it. Most MPs will have 4, 5, 6 staff. If you take them out for a Christmas meal, that's going to cost, I don't know, a couple of £100 or whatever. And everyone thinks, well, MPs are very well paid on 81,000, but most MPs will actually pay for this themselves, so it'll come out of their actual salary.
Yeah.
I take my producers out for a Christmas meal. I pay for it. I don't recharge it to my employer, though.
Nadine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate, given what happened, you know, with Partygate and everything, Christmas parties being a bit of a sticking point in Westminster. But it does look like, from what MPs from across parties, I've seen SNP MPs, I think James Cleverly was retweeted Jess Phillips on the issue that they just don't use it, and it's not something they've asked for. So, you know, I agree, like, it exists to try and put confidence in politics, IPSA, but this just seems very ill-judged, and MPs almost universally have said this is ridiculous, we won't do this, which is reassuring, I think.
Right. Well, of course, it's a few weeks until Christmas. I mean, as you say, you're feeling sorry, a little bit sorry for MPs who might have made that query. Are you damned if you do, damned if you don't?
I can't see any MPs doing this. You know, I'm sure the press will be trawling their published accounts to see if they will. But I suspect MPs are pretty cross with IPSA for making an issue of it, when I suspect, as Iain said and Alex says, they're paying for their own staff parties or celebrations. It's, you know, it's someone trying to sort of do down MPs yet again. There's enough information out there that people will see if they're doing this. I don't think MPs want to spend their office money on parties.
But I don't blame the Daily Mail. They're not doing down MPs. This is IPSA have come out with advice nobody asked for. It's a great story.
Some people obviously did ask for it. I think they were responding to query. All right, well, let's talk about something else, because Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has been addressing the Confederation of British Industry at the conference this morning and delivered a clear message on immigration. Let's have a listen.
Let me tell you, the days when low pay and cheap labour are part of the British way on growth must end. This isn't about Brexit. All around the world, business is waking up to the fact we live in a new era for labour. And while they're adapting, our low growth model is holding us back. It's why we've set out a new deal for working people that will deliver higher pay, stronger rights and better work. Not just for social justice, but also for the new reality on growth.
That's Sir Keir Starmer at the CBI. We're joined now by Simon Collassie-Aldridge, Chief Campaign Director at the Confederation of British Industry. Welcome to you. You heard what Keir Starmer was saying there. You want, broadly, more immigration to plug labour shortages. Is Keir Starmer wrong?
What we need, and what Keir set out today, was needing a short-term plugging the gap, as you described it, but also a longer-term skills policy that makes sure we're training up UK workers. But you can't have one without the other. Workforce challenges are inflationary, and we're in a pretty high inflationary environment right now. So we do need all parties to look past politics and understand that we do need more workers in the UK right now, as well as obviously training up, flexing apprenticeship levy, having a better skills policy to make sure that in the longer term we have more people in the workforce. And
when you say short term, what sort of timescale are we talking about? Are we saying for 5 years, for 10 years?
So my key ask of government on this one is there is a body, the Migration Advisory Committee, who have a thing called the Shortage Occupation List, and that is their entire job to look across the whole economy, because there are shortages across the whole economy, and understand which sectors need workers, for how long, what kinds of workers, what salary thresholds, all of those sorts of things. So I don't need to answer that question, because we have a clear we have a clear body in government that can do that for us.
Right.
We need them really to do that.
And from your perspective, which particular areas now would benefit from immigration or workers from abroad to plug gaps in the market?
So there are particular challenges right now in hospitality and health and social care. And on that latter one, on health and social care, one of the other big workforce pressures right now is workforce inactivity. So people who are out of the workforce because they're unwell, or people who are out of the workforce because they're caring for people who are unwell. And the impact of the worker shortages in health and social care has a direct impact on bringing those people back into the workforce. So you need to do both. You need to make sure that you're bringing in more workers in health and social care, so they're helping to bring more inactive people back into the workforce, as well as I was saying, making sure you're training up people in the longer term too.
Right, and care workers have been added to that labour shortage list. Are there other areas you'd like to see included?
Yeah, so another really good example of this is HGV drivers. We saw in the last, debacle around HGV drivers and not having enough of those in the workforce. Warehouse workers were then trained to be HGV drivers. There are now not enough warehouse workers. So because there are not enough workers in the economy right now, there are not enough workers in the UK, just moving one problem from one place to another. So I really would love for the Migration Advisory Committee to look at that kind of whole economy approach and make sure that we have all of the workforce that we need as we develop UK skills.
Right. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer said there's going to be under a Labour government, some sort of conditionality, if that is a word, but conditions attached. So if you wanted to add new sectors to the labour shortages list and increase immigration into those areas, that you, business, would have to invest more in skills in the British workforce. Do you agree and sign up to that?
So we had already signed up to that. As I was saying before, that is something we want. We want to train more workers in the UK. Right now we have an apprenticeship levy that is incredibly inflexible. You have long apprenticeships. There is not enough flexibility, which means that, you know, workers can't train the workers that they need at the time they need. My dad's a mechanic. When he started out, he learned how to fix engines, internal combustion engines. Cars then got computers, but at no point did he have to completely retrain for a number of years. He did little bits of on-the-job learning, little courses here and there to make sure that he can fix the car of the future. Our current apprenticeship levy does not allow for that. It is inflexible. Flexing that apprenticeship levy means that businesses can get the skills that they need. I subscribe to that. That is something that we are calling for.
All right.
You've got to do both, though, because there are just not enough workers in the UK right now.
So I must stay with us. Angela, listening to that, there aren't enough workers in the UK right now. So Keir Starmer saying he wants to wean the UK off its dependency on immigration. It's a long-term goal, isn't it?
Yes, it has to be. I think there's an immediate short-term goal to be achieved here, and that does involve, as the CBI is saying, some immigration. But part and parcel of that, you can't use that always as a way to try and plug gaps. And neither can you say, as the government's saying, we're not having any more immigration. What you need is I think, much more pragmatic approach and short-term answers, but a long-term strategy. And I think you only get that if you work together with industry and with business.
But you expect there are going to be high levels of immigration in the short term, which could be up to 5 years?
There may be. I'm not going to say put a time scale on it, because there's got to be training in the work that's got to be done. And the other part of it is bringing people back into the workforce that's left. We saw a lot of that, particularly after COVID, where people have left the workforce for various reasons. Some of those could be encouraged back as well. But it is a case of saying our longer-term strategy is to make sure we train people in the UK so we don't have these labour shortages where we can only rely on overseas labour. And that's been one of the problems at the moment, and why we're seeing, particularly in the hospitality industry, we're seeing more pubs closed now than we saw during COVID.
Happy to have higher levels of immigration to fill hospitality, health and social care?
Well, it's not a change from anything, is it? And I think that we've been talking about, for a long time from our government, about growing people's wages, high skill economy, making sure we try and get people into the workforce and get them into place of work. And yet we come back to the same arguments. Well, actually, we just need to keep having immigration because inflation's gone up, wage inflation's gone up. Well, that was always going to be the case. You cannot have a high wage economy and not have wage inflation. So if we want to go back to the situation of, well, in order to control that, we'll just bring people in. When does come the point that you don't bring people in to do that? When does come that point? And I actually still have a fundamental issue with this idea of bringing in, say, nurses from abroad and people from abroad. What happens in those countries? What happens in the countries they're coming from when you take that workforce out? Right.
I mean, Nadine, listening to what Alec is saying, what happens in that period of time while people are being trained up here?
Well, I think the simple answer is more immigration, right? This isn't, as the lady from the CBI was saying, this isn't an issue that can be, avoided moving forward if the country truly wants growth. And as the OBR said in its report, immigration is going to be key to growing an economy which has stagnated. And as I was saying earlier, one of the kind of legacies of Liz Truss is getting the conversation focused on growth. Keir here, I think, is kind of walking a very fine line between trying to bring in voters that voted Brexit and wanted a reduction in immigration in 2019, but also trying to keep more Labour voters who were more sympathetic to immigration on side, and also trying to be more pragmatic, whereas with the government, particularly with cabinet ministers like Suella Braverman, they're heavily against immigration regardless of the consequences. So I think Labour is trying to walk kind of fine line, trying not to annoy anyone too much in their approach.
Do you accept what Nadine said, Iain, in terms of it being a driver of growth, higher levels of immigration?
No, I don't at all. I mean, Labour are criticising the Conservatives for having low growth over the last 12 years, and compared to other European economies, that's a fair accusation. We've had very high immigration over the last few years. Now, I have no objection to immigration. I think immigration needs to be at least in part related to the skills needed in the economy. But the CBI have got a damn cheek, to be honest, because they're the ones that have caused this, because their members, or their bigger members, haven't been investing in skills. They haven't been investing investing in the training that's been needed. And now they blame the government because they want the cheap labour that they've had for the last 20 years back. Well, they're not going to get
Isn't
it.
that why you need a partnership between the two? You need government
Absolutely.
and business and industry working together for a longer-term strategy. Otherwise,
And
we
there
just
needs to be a
Well, let me put that back to Simon, because that is a pretty strong claim from Iain, that actually you failed, Simon, and the CBI and businesses have failed to do exactly what you set out, which is why we're suffering to some extent from shortages in the workforce, because there hasn't been enough investment in skills.
There could definitely be more investment in skills on both sides, on both the business side and on the government side. But as I was saying before, we have a very constrained skills system, with the apprenticeship levy being the main focus of that. We have to flex that. The skills environment, the jobs that we need, they don't require long apprenticeships. They require shorter courses. They require different kinds of skills. They require different kinds of training. And the skills framework that exists right now, it just isn't set up to deliver the skills that the UK needs. And so that is what we're really encouraging government for.
Iain?
Well, you can't just blame the apprenticeship levy. I mean, that's just copping out. You've got an education secretary now who was an apprentice herself, who was a skills minister herself. So I would suggest that we're in a pretty good position now to get apprenticeships sort of increase in importance, because I'll tell you, whenever I cover apprenticeships on my radio show, the phone lines go mad. It's a subject that people really care about, but it's not just the levy that is holding back, it's the investment of big companies that are members of your organisation.
Well, Simon, I know you've got to go on stage in a few minutes' time, so we've got to let you go. But just before you go, do you think now, standing there, you could say that perhaps big business has lent in the past too heavily on cheap immigration from abroad?
I think the OBR's own forecast shows the need to have flexible workforce that builds on local skills and migration as a need to have a productive economy. So I would look to the government's own numbers for analysis on what immigration has done for our growth.
All right, Simon Colassie, Aldridge, thank you very much. We'll let you get onto the stage. Do you accept, Alec, that at the moment, everything you are saying about stopping bringing in people from abroad is just out of kilter with the situation we find ourselves in, with industry and companies crying out for staff that cannot be trained overnight?
But I think we are in danger of moving about phantom troops. I mean, if we just draw on the truck driver, lorry driver situation, Germany itself had 80,000 shortage of lorry drivers. So the idea that we've got this huge pool of immigration that will come in and solve all the problems doesn't start to look at the situation that's happening in the countries which we claim we can get the immigration in from.
Angela?
I don't think anyone's suggesting that. Alex seems to be creating a problem and a solution that no one's suggesting. What we're saying, there's got to be a pragmatic approach to this. There does have to be, unless we've got a lot of migrant workers in this country who contribute to our economy and protect our public services, they should be welcomed. In the short term, we may have more people coming in to fill those gaps that we haven't trained, but the longer-term strategy has to be a planned economy for growth with government and business working together. It can't be government washing their hands and saying we're not engaging. It can't be business, as Iain's pointed out, saying it's all the government's fault. There's got to be a completely different way of doing this for the long-term future of the economy. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have much lower growth than any other European country or comparable economy.
I mean, there has to be a transition here. Nobody's suggesting that you should turn the tap off immediately.
Whether it should go up,
as we've heard, there is a migration advisory committee. It is their job to advise the government on how many people are needed in particular sectors. We have a point system. Now, that's got to be tweaked along the way. But you would hope that within the next 10 years, and I realise that's a long time, that the CBI and employers can get their acts together and make sure that we can train people in this country. So to that extent, I think Keir Starmer's onto something.
But I also think the fact that there are a lot of economically inactive people because of long COVID, because they can't get help on the NHS. I mean, the NHS mental health care is virtually non-existent and essentially privatised in this country. There'll be a lot of people who are suffering with depression and anxiety, and that should be the priority. But also, they could be working, and a lot of them will feel depressed and anxious that they're not contributing to the economy, particularly the rhetoric we see on television. So there needs to be health and the economy are inextricably linked. So we can't really. The worker shortages we have, in part, could be solved if we had an effective healthcare system.
That's true, but as Jeremy Hunt pointed out in the budget, there are 600,000 people who are economically inactive,
yeah.
but could be active. So the challenge is to get them back into the workplace.
Right, what people always want to know is what is a reasonable figure, Alec, for net migration? What's a reasonable level for people to actually be able to look at that and say, yes, that's what we were promised?
Well, I mean, that's subjective to everybody from their own personal perspective. I think what we have
parties,
to...
the parties have been clear. You'll remember the Conservatives, certainly in David Cameron's time, talked about bringing down net migration to tens of thousands. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, now says she would like to get down to below 100,000. People want to know what is a reasonable, acceptable level of net migration.
And I think there's a reasonable point in that we've been having this discussion about migration coming in, yet we are in the hundreds of thousands of people who do migrate. And I think when we're looking at this subject overall, I don't think it's about what's an acceptable level. It's about, are we actually going to invest in the people in this country and train them here and raise their wages, or are we just going to fall back to the model? I mean, if the answer to that question is, well, what it's been over the last 20 years, well, then expect everybody to sit on minimum wage. I
mean, we're looking at the moment at around 240,000. The Office for Budget Responsibility in its forecast, Angela, said that net migration would probably come down to about 205,000 by 2026. Is that about right for you, or would a Labour government want to see it lower?
We've never put a figure on net migration. I think it's a bit of a meaningless figure, if I'm honest. I don't know why the government got into this in the first place. If you are losing...
Meaningless or unachievable?
No, I'm saying meaningless for this reason. If you are losing lots of highly skilled workers that benefit this country who leave to get jobs in other countries and bring in fewer lower paid workers, net migration figures may change, but it's not helping the economy. I think what we've heard today from the CBI and from Keir is a way forward that doesn't play around with numbers, but looks at what the economy needs and what's in the best interests. And it has to be, and I think Iain's talked about a transition, but it is that short-term arrangements and longer-term plans. But let's not just say if we've got lower net migration, that's better. We might be losing some very highly skilled, highly qualified workers. And just to play the numbers game on immigration really doesn't achieve much at all.
But I would just go for the definition of what the economy needs or what British workers need, because the CBI would say that the economy needs cheap immigration labour coming in to bring inflation down, whereas what British workers want is to see their wages rise and their skill base rise.
So
those two statements are separate statements.
I mean, is there discomfort on the right of the Conservative Party with the discussion about higher levels of immigration, even to fill short-term vacancies?
Well, the right of the Conservative Party have always wanted lower immigration for all sorts of different, sometimes reasonable, sometimes very unreasonable reasons. I don't think that most people now recognise this tens of thousands figure. It was a figure quoted by the Conservative Party to give a signal that they wanted lower immigration. It's as simple as that. And that's what actually Keir Starmer's doing today as well, signalling to voters in the red wall seats that he wants lower immigration too. So there's a lot of politics at play here as well as economics. Personally, I don't have a problem with higher rates of immigration if the economy needs higher rates of immigration after we've got the skills to offer the jobs to British workers first. I mean, the whole point of a successful immigration system is to plug holes in the economy where they can't be filled by British workers.
All right, you can hear more on this subject on Newscast. Just take a look.
Newscast. Newscast from the BBC.
You can get that on BBC Sounds, and of course it will feature Adam Fleming and Chris Mason, my BBC colleagues. Let's just have a look at this tweet from our guest here, Alec Shelbrooke. I'm proud to have supported Liz Truss from the very start with her positive vision for our country and the Union. This was from August, as you can see, the 22nd. Has that tweet aged well, Alec?
Well, I still believe in it. And I still believe that Liz Truss's policy of breaking the orthodoxy is the right way forward. In many ways ties into the conversation we've just had, where we have organisations like the CBI saying we've got to have more immigration. We have the idea that, well, before we do anything, we have to satisfy the fact that the Bank of England put the markets in a position where they weren't willing to accept any shocks like that. And I'm not saying that we didn't make mistakes. That would be daft to say that. Clearly we did.
She's no longer Prime Minister.
But went too fast in the mini-budget. I accept all of that. But what now's happened is that the political consensus has been one of, well, we must just balance the books first before we do anything else. That's the consensus. So I still am proud that I backed Liz. I still believe in the philosophy she had, and I hope that we do get back to that under the new Prime Minister, that is something that I think Conservative governments need to be focusing on.
Was it just a case of too much, too fast?
Well, it's easy to look at it like that. Clearly, that mini budget was too much, too fast.
But was there something more fundamental than that in terms of Liz Truss?
Well, the
and her
fundamental
economic
problem with
perspectives?
Liz Truss is that she could not communicate what she wanted to do, and she didn't roll the pitch before she announced what she wanted to do. Admittedly, she did what she said she was going to do in the leadership election, but she's never been a good communicator. And if you're going to do something radical, you have to be able to communicate to the electorate why you're doing it and what the consequences will be. Now, before we came on air, Nadine was saying, well, she did actually, her legacy will be the fact that we're all talking about growth in a way that we didn't before. And I think that's absolutely right. But that's about the only positive thing I can think of anything she did or said during her 49 days, wasn't it? I think you said 44.
I did. Have I miscounted?
I think it might have been 49.
But thank you for that correction. Alec, what do you say in response to Iain?
Well, I think Ian's right in the sense that the strategy we wanted to employ was all purely focused around growth, and the pitch wasn't rolled, but there were circumstances at the time that conspired, which is why I think that too much was done in that budget to not have the pitch rolled. So I think that there was a whole host of packages came through because of the circumstance at the time they hadn't been trailed. We were stuck in a window of before the conference season started that we had to sort out the energy price cap. And I remember during the campaign when we were having a meeting and there was lots of talk about you had to cap energy and stuff. And I specifically said, nobody go out and criticise these policies because we've got to keep everything on the table, which indeed is what happened. So I think that perhaps we should just focus down on various issues. But what fundamentally the markets didn't like was the £150 billion liability on the energy price cap for 2 years.
Well, except, Alec, that was already priced in a few days before the mini-budget. But anyway, broadly, Angela, do you accept what Alec says? It was just a question of timing, sequencing, pitch rolling.
Apparently it was communications and pitch rolling. Of course it wasn't. It was a wrong budget for the wrong time. And the country is paying for that. And
so
it came against... You've had 12 years in government. We didn't see the growth strategy there, and we had a budget that was said for growth strategy. It crashed the economy. Reason we're talking about such massive cuts now, and it's not just because of Liz Truss. Liz Truss was 12 years in government beforehand.
Although the spending cuts, or they're not cuts really, it's a restraint. Because actually Jeremy Hunt's put more money into the economy, certainly in the short term. Well, look, he says spending cuts later, post-election. If we can get through to the election, then we'll do more cuts as well. I think it's...
Well, if you win, you'll have to do them as well.
Well, wait and see. There's things we could have done. The non-dom status, that would help fund some of the economy and don't sigh.
Well,
this actually matters.
200 years non-dom status rate. It's £1.8 billion.
Yeah,
I'm not saying the policy's wrong, but it's not a magic bullet.
Who's suggesting it is? It's part of the package.
But it's always the first thing people say.
And there's also, if you wait for a moment, calm down. You've got the non-dom status, you've got the windfall tax, which the government's played around with. They've never really done it properly.
But they have extended it.
They've extended it, but you could have backdated it. You could not take away the loopholes that are in it. There's lots of things that could be done to bring the economy back into growth. And also it needs, again, the longer-term strategy. But Nick, We've had so many budgets in such a short space of time, so many chances in a short space of time, and the economy isn't working because of the actions of the last 12 years of this government, including Liz Truss.
I mean, Nadine, let's go back to your point about growth being talked about much more than perhaps in previous years. Do you think that that is Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's legacy?
I mean, it's obviously not the only part of their legacy. The obvious legacy is the mini-budget, which was never, ever really a mini-budget, and what it did to the economy. Mortgage rates are still suffering because of that. There's going to be a lot of people entering the end of 2-year fixed-term mortgages, 5-year fixed-term mortgages that are really going to suffer. So her biggest legacy is the damage she did to the economy. But if you wanted to say a positive part of her legacy, it was that we all talk about growth now, and it's something that economists have been talking about for a very long time. The Resolution Foundation, IPPR, IFS.
And the Labour Party.
Yeah, and
as if Conservatives haven't talked about growth.
But I think
does anyone really seriously think that growth is not a good thing, apart from some extreme environmentalists?
So why hasn't it happened? We've got got the worst growth of any comparable
absolutely.
economy because of the actions taken by the Conservative government over the last 12 years. We've put on the table the kind of things that could be done with green energy, for example, and look into the economy of the future and the industry of the future. Everything is too short-term at the moment. There needs that longer-term strategy if we're going to get back to growth.
Well, we haven't heard it from the Labour Party.
Well,
you have heard
no, we
it.
haven't.
You're not listening.
We
you have.
One of the things I would
Have.
add about Liz Truss as well, it wasn't just, you know, the mini budget and that was an issue. It was the lack of listening to officials. You know, Tom Scholar was sacked on day one. Everybody around them that was giving them the advice, senior civil servants doing a very important job at advising ministers impartially, laying out the environment and saying this could be the consequences of X. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were absolutely committed to not listening to anybody, didn't listen to some of the concerns from their own MPs, didn't listen to concerns from economists, didn't listen to concerns from civil servants. I think that was also a key issue with her administration, is that you can't not listen to people in politics. You can't be that deeply ideological and ignore the practical realities on the ground because of something that you've always wanted to do.
Do you accept that?
Well, I think we just come back to the point that we just keep talking about no growth. The reality is in the 21st century, it's been declining growth throughout. The policies, the orthodoxy has not worked. Now we're just starting this show with people.
So you think previous Conservative governments have been wrong? They've been wrong since 2010.
Government of the 21st century, which has been a Labour government, a coalition government, a Conservative government, a minority government, a Conservative government, split 50-50 over the period of time almost, in terms of Labour and the Conservative side.
Well,
and we start this show by talking about the CBI saying, well, we've just got to increase migration people in because that will bring down inflation.
But you have
Nothing is changing.
Yeah, but you've supported all these Conservative governments, Alec Shelbrooke, and
all
all their
things change throughout the time of the period. I mean, look, we come into a coalition government with a world banking crisis. We then have Brexit, which goes on. We then have a pandemic.
You chose
and let's
Brexit.
not rule out. Well, actually, the British people chose Brexit. The British people. I voted Remain. Okay, but the British people
Are you saying that Brexit
said
is responsible for this?
17 million people voted to leave the European Union. It wasn't what I wanted, but I voted throughout Parliament to deliver what the British people asked for.
So
it's an irrelevant comment
Well,
to make.
let Angela respond.
The point I was asking you about is you said one of the problems you've had is we've had to deal with Brexit.
But we've had to process Brexit. We've had to do things along the way.
And the way the
There's been a
government handled
fundamental
it.
change to the way that this country trades, but that's what people asked for in a referendum, in a 17 general election, in a 19 general election, and as soon as we got that done, we get a world pandemic. There's been a lot of things along the way, but fundamentally, across the 21st century, the economic strategies of governments are creating declining growth, not negative growth, but declining growth.
Right, and there has been anaemic growth over the
Worse
last
in the
12
UK.
years. But actually, Labour did support quite a lot of the tax-cutting agenda of Liz Truss. So you obviously saw that cutting the basic rate of income tax from 20 pence to 19 pence would be stimulating growth.
We think there's different ways of taxation, and one of the problems is it's always working people on the lower incomes that are paying the highest price. Middle earners now are going to struggle more. We still came back to, and you'll shout at me again, but things like non-DOMs and the windfall tax could have helped a great deal, and the government chose not to do those things.
What the tax-free allowance was when the Conservatives came to power after 13 years of Labour. Well, I'll tell you, it was £6,500. Well, which party has doubled that to £12,500?
And we changed it as well. There's changes been made, but at the moment, you ask working people if they feel more comfortable now than they did when this government came to power, and they will tell you they are struggling more now
that is true.
than they have done for a very long time.
And that's the challenge for the Conservatives at the next election.
Which they haven't met so
How do
far.
they answer the question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
They're not going to be answered, are they? There's no answer to that.
On that, let me just show you this tweet from Pippa Crerar, political editor at The Guardian. Number 10, expected to appoint individual to investigate Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, claims imminently, possibly even today. It's understood that they'll have a say on their own remit, meaning they could look into claims beyond 2 formal complaints. This is after, if you remember rightly, last Wednesday, just before Prime Minister's questions with the 2 deputies, Dominic Raab representing the government, he called on Rishi Sunak to actually carry out that investigation. So we are going to find out probably in the next day or so who that individual will be. He was asked about it this morning. Let's have a look.
Deputy Prime Minister, are you confident you're going to clear your name?
Absolutely. Morning, sir. Morning.
Well, that was short and sweet, but absolutely, he said there. Let's talk about this headline. Another policy announcement by Keir Starmer in The Observer will abolish Lords to restore trust in politics. How will it restore trust in politics, Angela?
I think that's a bit of a leeway because I was at the meeting. Yeah, getting rid of me.
Is that going to solve the problem?
Iain, he likes me really. He doesn't mean it.
I do.
I think what he's talking about is a different kind of House of Lords, a second chamber. It can't be any surprise to anybody that the Labour Party prefers an elected second chamber, but it's part of a parcel of things I think we have to do looking at trust in politics. It's not just about that. I think what has happened in recent times, particularly with David Cameron and Boris Johnson, is the way that peerages have been awarded to people. And if the reports of Liz Truss getting a resignation honours list for the House of Lords, Boris Johnson putting in 4 sitting MPs, that has affected the issue about trust. Now, on Friday, the House of Lords was actually debating the issue of how to change the appointments process. I do think it's interesting that for the first time in history, it's the House of Lords have sometimes been calling for changes and a much smaller House. And it's the government that's saying, no, you can't do that. So there's serious change and reform that is needed.
Would you agree with an elected House of Lords? Would it restore trust?
I think before you do anything, you're going to have to define what you want the House of Lords to do. The Commons is the superior chamber. That's who people elect as their politicians. The House of Lords doesn't actually have any power. If we go back to the Brexit years, the only reason that House of Lords amendments were creating havoc was because the House of Commons voted for them. The House of Lords is there as a revising chamber, give more scrutiny to it. If it is to be elected, and quite frankly, you'll find 650 MPs say it should go and 650 different ideas about what it should be. I remember in my first term, we had a vote on the floor of the House. I think there were 8 different motions brought forward, and every single one of them was defeated. And governments, it's a bit of an esoteric argument about House of Lords reform. It doesn't come up on the doorstep, and fundamentally, governments soon realise that it starts eating away legislative time and best just carry on. But let's not pretend that the House of Lords have power. They have a revising chamber, they send it back to the Commons, and it's up to the Commons as to whether they accept it or not.
I disagree with that. There's a lot of political capital that comes from being a member of the House of Lords. That's why people scramble for it. But also having the right to scrutinise legislation and make amendments is huge. That is a huge amount of power. And a lot of the amendments
have to be agreed by the Commons.
Yeah, but they're often accepted. But the fact that it even gets that, the fact that it even gets that far, the average person on the street can't influence legislation like that. So the idea that it has soft power insofar as it can change the direction the government takes. I would say with the House of Lords, I do think it's inevitable that it will become an elected chamber. I think it's a bit of an anachronism. But I understand the argument when people say there's a lot of people with expertise in the House that wouldn't necessarily be there if it was an elected second chamber. But the idea that it doesn't have any power, as I said, there's a reason why people scramble for peerages.
Iain?
They talk of little else down the dog and duck. I think that both parties should go into the next election with a clear commitment of House of Lords reform and spell out what they would do. Alec is absolutely right. If you put 8 different proposals to the House of Commons, you're never going to get a consensus.
But it's happened before, hasn't it? We've been talking about House of Lords reform for decades, practically.
We have. The problem we have is that the House of Lords actually generally does quite a good job, given its remit. So there is an argument to say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I completely get that. But you wouldn't start from here. I mean, if you were creating a second chamber, you would not start with 92 hereditary peers.
And by-elections
all of whom ought to be abolished immediately. I think most people would accept that.
There's some things you could do now, aren't there, Iain, as well? There's things we could do very easily now.
Well, if they were easy, they would have done before.
Well, the government stopped us. The House of Lords would vote for some significant changes, but the government won't let us.
The House of Commons wouldn't let you. And this is the point. There were 8 free votes. There were 8 free votes, and they were all
Alex, you're
defeated.
missing the point. The government won't provide time. There are lots of things about the Appointments Commission. We could change how that operates, the size of the House, which I think MPs would pretty much go along with us. And it could be done quite straightforward and quite quickly.
It's not where people's priorities are at.
Absolutely
not.
Reforming
the House of Lords is not people's
The danger is that you're going to get essentially a load of failed politicians, failed MPs, people who've lost their seats, who want to go into the House of Lords afterwards, and they stand for election for that. A bit like police and crime commissioners.
Well, you're nodding away there, Angela. Do you agree?
I'm nodding. Iain and I have had these discussions so many times about the House of Lords, and I suppose I would end up saying...
But would it be stacked full of failed politicians?
Well, some people say it is now, and that wasn't fair either. But I think there is an argument to say there's significant reform that can be done, that can make a difference, but don't throw the baby out the bathwater. Those essential things about the scrutinising of legislation, which sometimes we're the only part of Parliament that's doing that, looking at the detail. I think the public like this independence element, where there's crossbenchers from no political
Can I look at the resignation?
Well, they would be gone under.
Well, let's have a look at the resignation honours list, because it's reported Boris Johnson has nominated more than a dozen close political allies to head to the Lords. Is that justifiable?
What's always happened. And
Should
No,
it
it
not?
hasn't. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown didn't have resignation
They put
on
about...
this
No,
list.
Tony Blair did put about 370 people.
I was just going to say, the idea Tony Blair didn't put anybody in the House of Lords.
I'm not saying that,
Who
but
put you in the House of Lords,
hang on.
Angela?
Gordon Brown.
Exactly.
On the dissolution list. No, hang on. The thing about Tony Blair's resignation, let's be clear about this. We had far fewer peers than anybody else. And when the hereditary peerages ended, apart from the 92, all parties wanted some of the working peers hereditaries to go back in, and they went under Tony Blair's name.
Please don't try and make out that it's
Yeah.
just Conservatives who put their cronies. Tom Watson, for example. I mean, can you really justify Tom Watson being in the House of Lords, given his record on the
I can absolutely justify that. But the important thing is, I think, my own view is that resignation honours lists have had their day. For an outgoing Prime Minister to put somebody in the legislature for life, particularly when those people are currently serving in the House of Commons.
Let me put that to Alex. Should Rishi Sunak veto Boris Johnson's peerages list? Is it time to end this?
No, I don't think he should veto it, because that's changing the rules of the game mid-game. If there is the call for these things to change, then that needs to be debated. But the idea you just suddenly decide now and change it is not how the process works. Let me just take you quickly back to January when Tony Blair got his garter and there was a huge kick-off. Of course Tony Blair should have had his garter. He was a Prime Minister. Should it end, this resignation honours list from former Prime Ministers?
I don't think it's good for public trust. I think it should be more transparent. If we're going to have the House of Lords still existing, there should be a clear evidence of why these people are being put on their merit. It's a scrutiny chamber. If it's going to have people scrutinising legislation, it should have experts. It shouldn't have mates of Prime Ministers who get it as like a...
But if it's elected, who's going in? Because it will be a party list system, a bit like...
Well, that's what I said earlier. That would be one of the things that would be a negative, because you wouldn't have these experts in the chamber. But I do think this habit of appointing friends...
This is why no one ever agrees, because then you can't come to those conclusions.
Right. Well, just though very briefly, if it was elected, would you stand for election?
Depends when the elections were, but I feel I've been an elected politician for a long time. I've been in the House of Lords.
Well, in principle, never mind about timing.
In principle, I think that we want good people to stand for election to a second chamber to scrutinise legislation. Whether I choose to, time will tell.
And in terms of it being in competition, in conflict with the House of Commons, isn't that the biggest problem?
I think it's one of the things that has to be ironed out. So the House of Commons must always be the primary chamber. It is now. They're elected by the public, and that's what I say, that the devil's in the detail on these things. But it's no surprise to anybody that the Labour Party has said this time and time again about elected chamber. The difficulty is how you get to the detail, you make it work, and you don't rival the House of Commons, but you still do the detail of legislation and the heavy lifting of legislation.
Well, a brief look ahead to tomorrow's programme. Of course, we'll be covering live and uninterrupted Prime Minister's questions tomorrow. This might come up. This story in The Guardian. Rishi Sunak is registered with private GP practice offering £250 consultations. Campaigners say poorest people will suffer most as NHS is neglected and private practice becomes the norm. Does it matter Rishi Sunak is signed up with a private GP or not?
Doesn't matter to me, because ultimately that's somebody not going to the local GP. And what's often overlooked in this country is that GPs are private businesses.
Angela, does it matter? Should it matter to people if Rishi Sunak is registered with private GP practice?
I think what matters more to people is whether they can get an appointment with their local GP when they want one. And I think that's the question people are asking. Does Rishi Sunak understand that? That's what they'll be asking. So I think on its own, it's not the big issue. But if it means he doesn't properly understand what it's like for everybody else. But the idea that the Prime Minister wouldn't get top treatment on the NHS is ludicrous, though, isn't it?
I mean, does it show an out-of-touch side or not?
Well, if you think that a Prime Minister can only understand what being unemployed is like if he is unemployed or she is unemployed, then I suppose it should matter. I mean, he understands that there's a problem with waiting lists. Just because he goes private, that doesn't mean to say he doesn't understand it. If I had £700 million, I'd probably do the same. I think most people would. This story is all about the politics of envy.
Nadine?
I think the public will probably be a bit annoyed about this. If they've got relatives who are sitting around in A&E for, over a day, they're probably thinking, well, why is the Prime Minister having private healthcare? We can't afford private
I would just
healthcare.
flip that, though, and say they'd probably be more annoyed if they were waiting. The Prime Minister with 700 million quid in the bank was sat there waiting to see the NHS doctor.
I disagree. And also, if you look at Boris Johnson, he made a big thing about the fact the NHS treated him when he had COVID. You know, if a Prime Minister truly believes in our NHS, it should be good enough for him. I think that's what a lot of people will be thinking, rather than him going...
All right, well, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I will be back, as said, at 11:15 tomorrow for more Politics Live, covering PMQs on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.